start today with a story, and it's not a very happy story. It's about a man called Michael Price. And Michael Price was an assistant manager, 48 years old, at a Walmart in the United States. And one day he was helping a woman to her car when he unfortunately suffered a heart attack. He collapsed, he was rushed to the hospital, but unfortunately he died a week later, and he was survived by his wife and 2 young children. Now, Michael, it turns out, had a life insurance policy that paid out more than $300,000, but Michael's family didn't see a single cent of that money. Instead, the $300,000 went to Walmart, who had purchased the life insurance policy for Michael, named itself the beneficiary. And they had done this without Michael's knowledge. When Michael's widow heard about this, she was outraged. Michael had been really overworked at the company, and she said they used him terribly, then they go out and collect $300,000. It's very immoral. So there seems to be something morally repugnant about profiting from the suffering of others. And this applies even when the profiteer is not directly responsible for the suffering. We can see this in psychology studies. My colleagues, Yoel Imbar, Fari Cushman, and Dave Pizarro did a study where they looked at people's perceptions of a money manager who was investing in catastrophe bonds. These are bonds whose outcome, whose maturity really depends on a catastrophic outcome happening or not happening. This experiment had 2 conditions. In the harm condition, the bonds would only mature if a severe earthquake would strike a developing country sometime in the next 2 years. And in the no harm condition, the bonds would only mature if a severe earthquake did not strike a developing country in the next 2 years. In both conditions of the experiment, the bonds end up maturing, the money manager makes his profit, and the question is, what do people think of this money manager who profited either from harm or from no harm? And what they find is that even though there's no way this money manager could have been responsible for an earthquake striking this distant country, when he profits from the suffering of others, people find him more blameworthy, less moral, less trustworthy. So we don't like people who profit from the suffering of others. But do we apply this principle to our own behavior? All across the world, universal moral codes generally prohibit profiting from the suffering of others, benefiting yourself at the expense of someone else. This is put really eloquently by Adam Smith in his theory of moral sentiments. He writes, "For one man unjustly to promote his own advantage from the loss or disadvantage of another is more contrary to nature than death, than poverty, than pain, than all the misfortunes which can affect him." Now, Adam Smith, of course, is not the first to point out this kind of sentiment, and in fact, it can be traced back at least until biblical times, when we see the first mention of the phrase filthy lucre, and this is money gained through dishonest or dishonorable means. Now, the way that we talk about filthy lucre, sometimes called dirty money or blood money or ill-gotten gains, suggests that the very value of money itself can be tainted by immoral associations. And what I'm going to show you today is some evidence that we've collected in our lab to support this idea. So in our experiments, we bring people into the lab and we invite them to trade off money against pain that's delivered either to themselves or another person. So they can gain money by delivering electric shocks either to themselves or to a stranger that they don't know. And these electric shocks, we deliver them to the wrist, and they don't cause any physical damage, so they're within the limits of what we're able to do ethically within the lab, but they are unpleasant enough that people will give up money to avoid getting them. They last for about a half a second. They feel a little bit like a brief wasp sting or running your hand briefly under very hot water. So in our experiments, we bring in 2 people at a time into the lab, and they're led to different rooms so they don't see one another or interact face-to-face, although they do know that there is another person there. And then we start with a pain thresholding procedure where we hook them up to our stimulation device. We use this thresholding to create an individualized shock stimulus for each person that's quite unpleasant but not intolerable. It's set at a level 8 on a 10-point scale where 10 is intolerable pain. And importantly, people differ quite a bit in how they react to these shocks, so we match the subjective unpleasantness of pain across all the people in the experiment, and everyone knows that each person is getting their own level 8 in the study. Then we randomly assign the 2 participants to the roles of decider and receiver. And then the decider goes on to complete a decision-making task. It looks like this, and in the task, on every trial, they're choosing between different amounts of money and different numbers of shocks. So for example, 7 shocks and you get 10 pounds, or 10 shocks and you get 15 pounds. The decider always gets the money, but half the time the shocks are for the decider as well, and the other half the time the shocks are for this other person, for the receiver. So essentially what we're measuring is how much money people have to be paid to inflict pain on either themselves or another person that they don't know. And across a number of trials, we vary the amounts of money and the amounts of pain that are at stake, and we can use our participants' choices to work out an exchange rate in terms of pounds per shock that they require to inflict pain either on themselves or this other person. Just to give you a sense of the kinds of exchange rates we see in our experiments, at one end of the scale, we have participants who refuse to deliver even a single shock to another person for a profit of 20 pounds. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have people who are willing to deliver 20 painful shocks to another person for a profit of 10 pence. Those are the people who also score higher on questionnaires that measure psychopathic traits. Okay, so we measure people's preferences, the exchange rates for pain for themselves and pain for others. And one really big question that we had when we started this research is what compensation would people require to shock themselves versus to shock someone else? And if you look from the perspective of economics, there have been hundreds of studies in behavioral economics over the past several decades that ask people to exchange different amounts of money with one another. And basically what we've learned from this research is 2 things. 1, people do care about others more than nothing. And 2, people care about themselves a whole lot more. So this perspective predicts that people should require some compensation to inflict pain on others. They shouldn't be able to do it for free, but they should require a whole lot more compensation to inflict the same amount of pain on themselves. But if our hypothesis is correct, if immoral actions corrupt the value of money, then people should require extra compensation to deliver pain to others relative to themselves. And that's in fact what we find. So we've done several experiments with this paradigm, and in every single experiment, on average, most people require more money to inflict pain on another person than to inflict the same amount of pain on themselves. So this is really encouraging. We're really inspired by this. But the question is, of course, why do we see this? Why do we see this happening? And of course, our favored hypothesis is that profits gained from an immoral action feel less valuable than profits gained from some morally neutral action. But we still need to rule out an alternative explanation, which is maybe people just think other people's pain is worse or more aversive somehow than their own pain. And one way we can rule out this alternative explanation is to take money out of the equation entirely and just ask people to divide up some pain between themselves and another person. And so with some colleagues in London, we did an experiment just this. We gave people basically the power to divide 24 shocks between themselves and an anonymous other person. And basically what we find in this experiment is that most people split the pain equally. And on average, the way that people divide up the pain really doesn't differ significantly from 50-50. So we don't really find any evidence that people think others' pain is worse than their own pain, which brings us back to our preferred explanation, which is that immoral profits feel less valuable. So one question that we might ask about this is, if the money you get from an immoral action actually is worth less to you than money you would get doing something that was morally neutral or even good, what happened to that value? Where did it go? And one hypothesis that we had was that there's some sort of extra cognitive processing that happens, a sort of self-regulation process, where this initial value of the money, because it's associated with an immoral action, gets downgraded somehow. And if this is the case, this makes a really specific prediction about how long people will take to make these kinds of decisions. So what we actually did is we compared how much time people take to decide about whether to profit from someone else's pain, and compare that to the amount of time they take deciding to profit from their own pain. If there's this extra processing step where the immorality of the action degrades the value, people should take longer to decide for others. And that's exactly what we find. And moreover, the more people slow down when they're deciding about other people's pain and whether to profit from it, the more they're willing to give up money to prevent pain to others relative to themselves, the more moral their choices are. So, how does this take place in the human brain? One model that we've been thinking about a lot lately is that moral goals are represented in the prefrontal cortex. That's the bit up here. It's the most recently evolved part of the brain. And these moral goals modify reward representations in the reward centers of the brain. Now, we know quite a bit about this circuitry, and one thing that we know is that it's regulated by dopamine. So dopamine is a brain chemical, and we predicted that if we perturb the dopamine system in the brain, if we gave people a drug that alters their levels of dopamine, this could perhaps disrupt moral behavior. So we did that in another experiment where we randomly assigned our participants to receive either a placebo pill or a drug called L-Dopa, which is the chemical precursor of dopamine, and it increases dopamine levels in the brain. Now, this drug at the dosage that we gave in our experiment is very, very subtle, and people can't actually tell whether they've received the drug or the placebo pill. On the placebo, we see, as before, that people require more compensation to shock another person than to shock themselves. But when we give people the drug that boosts dopamine, on average, that pattern goes away. People require no more compensation to shock others than themselves. Now, in these experiments, we boosted dopamine artificially. But there are a lot of stimuli out in the real world that boost dopamine and stimulate the dopamine system naturally. And these include stimuli that are related to rewards, things like money, sex, drugs, etc. And it's perhaps no coincidence that environments that seem to be teeming with stimuli that tend to stimulate dopamine are often associated with very bad behavior. So, in conclusion, we find evidence in our experiments that the value of money depends very strongly on its moral associations. And immoral actions can corrupt the value of money. And I think this is very easily illustrated with a little thought experiment. So imagine you're walking down the street and you see some cash lying on the ground. Probably your first instinct is, wow, that's awesome, lucky me, and stooping down to pick up that cash feels really great. But now imagine it's the same cash, but you just saw it fall out of someone else's pocket. Now how do you feel about picking that up? Probably, hopefully, you don't feel so great about it. So all of this paints a rather optimistic picture of human nature. And I would love to be able to end on a positive note. But instead, I will leave you with a bit of a warning. Because it turns out that there's a dangerous loophole in our moral code. It's true that we have a basic wiring that seems to degrade the value of money that comes from immoral actions, but the definition of what is immoral is ultimately up to us. And that's a big responsibility, and that can get us into trouble sometimes, and it's something we have to be very careful and vigilant about.